I am Boyd D. Clements, 217 North 2nd Street, P.O. Box 245, Elmwood, Nebraska, 68349. My age will be 78, the 20th of February, 2003. I recently went through my old military records and memorabilia for a church service and dinner to honor all war veterans. My kids seem to be quite interested, so I thought I might go through them and tell what I can remember on video. After looking at old pictures and orders, it does bring back a lot of old memories. I turned 18 in February 1943 and had to register for the draft. In order to pick my branch of service, I decided to enlist in naval pilot training. They required 3 letters of character reference. The first letter was from Dr. O.E. Liston, M.D., Elmwood, Nebraska, February 12th, 1943. To whom it may concern, this certifies that I have known Boyd Clements all his life. He is a fine, clean, energetic, honest young man. His health is excellent. I unequivocally recommend him for the position which he is applying. O.E. Liston, M.D. Man, I didn't know I was that good. The second one is from Green's Drug Store, established 1886, prescription and pharmacist. T.H. Green and Ralph W. Green. To whom it may concern, February 12, 1943. The bearer, Boyd Clements, is well known to me and is a young man of good personal habits, hard time reading it, honest, and has a great deal personality, and is able to apply himself. He comes from a good American family and is a loyal citizen. Ralph W. Green, registered pharmacist. This letter I really treasure. It's from Bess Streeter Aldrich, the well-known author from Elmwood, Nebraska, who wrote a lot of prairie-type books and is very well known. She's gone now, but we were very good friends with her family, and she was a very good friend of my mom. Bess Streeter Aldrich, The Elms, Elmwood, Nebraska. February 11th, 1943. To whom it may concern. This is to certify that I have known the bearer, Boyd Clement, since his birth, and that he is of excellent character. Respectfully, Mrs. Bess Streeter Aldrich. Several of her, she had a lot of books. One of them, Miss Bishop, was made into a movie. And she wrote a series of Christmas stories. Some of those were made into movies also. My Navy career really ended before it got started. I was accepted, and they sent about, I can't remember, 6 or 8 of us into Omaha to the Naval Recruiting Station to be sworn in. They had us lined up in the room up there to take an oath to get in, and somebody come out of the back room and says, "Hold it up." It says they've canceled that V-12 program. I think that's what it was, if I remember right. So they says, "Sorry boys, head for home," and that was the end of that. Looking back at that experience, I was lucky it turned out that way, because I get seasick, and I'm afraid I wouldn't have made a very good naval pilot off in a carrier or something if that's where I would have ended up. So I definitely wanted to get into flying, so then I beat it down to the Army recruiting station and enlisted in the Army Air Force. I'll show you my papers on that. War Department, Army Service Forces, Headquarters, 7th Service Command, Omaha, Nebraska, May 28th of May, 43. Recruiting and Induction Section, Headquarters, 7th Service Command, Omaha, Nebraska. Each of the following named privates, Air Force enlisted reservists, air crew, having been found qualified for aviation cadet appointment, is ordered to active duty and will proceed from the address indicated after his name to 224 Post Office Building, Omaha, Nebraska, reporting to the District Recruiting Officer no later than 3 p.m., 7th of June, 1943, and then will proceed from Omaha, Nebraska to the Army Air Force Basic Training Center, Shepherd Field, Texas, for pre-aviation cadet training. A few of the names on the list that were with me were David Alfrey from Louisville, Robert Breckenfield from Omaha, who has relatives buried at the Elmwood Cemetery, very good friend of John Camel from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Of course, Boyd Clements, and let's see, I forgot John Bloomer from Lincoln, and Bill Fenton. There he is from Lincoln. He was later in an air guard in Lincoln and crashed in a jet and was killed south of Lincoln after the war. There's one more name I just noticed. I don't remember him. Roy Stubbendeck, Unadilla, Nebraska. Some of this is kind of interesting. It says, in lieu of transportation and subsistence allowance en route, the FD will pay each of the above-named Air Corps enlisted reservists travel allowance 5 cents per mile from the address indicated to his name to Omaha, Nebraska, to be paid on arrival at the training center. Item 3, government transportation and meal tickets for 4 meals plus 2 extra meal tickets for procurement of necessary meals in cases of unavoidable delay en route, at a cost of not to exceed $1 per meal if served in a dining car and not to exceed $75 elsewhere. Will be furnished each man named in this letter by the Omaha District Recruiting Office. After we got up to the recruiting headquarters, they sent us out to, well, at that time it was Fort Crook, to be shipped down to Shepherd Field, Texas. And in the evening, they had us lined up out in front of one of the big buildings there at Fort Crook and telling us all our rules and regulations and so forth, and where we're going, what we're going to do. And some kids smoked and flipped a cigarette butt down on the ground. And that was our first introduction to the Army. This sergeant came unglued. He ate us out from one end to the other. And our whole group had to spend about an hour policing the area, and they taught us how to field strip cigarettes and throw them away. Needless to say, our group missed our supper and didn't get anything to eat till the next breakfast on the train. From Omaha, we took a troop train to Wichita Falls, Texas for basic training. Omaha to Wichita Falls. Don't have too much from basic training. I have a few photographs. I'll show them to you. This is me in front of the barracks. As you can see, our uniforms didn't fit too well. There I am with the gas mask on in this picture. That's a picture inside of the barracks. As you can see, there's a card game going on over there in the corner. That's the picture of the barracks that I stayed in, right there. That's a picture of the mess hall and they called it service center, but it didn't amount too much of a service center. This guy's name was Jones. He was from Iowa. I don't remember quite where, but he's taking care of two things at one time, writing letters home and taking care of business all at the same time. As I said before, I don't remember an awful lot about basic training, except it was hot and dirty and so forth. And remember when we first got our uniforms issued down here, we went through this big building down the line, and they'd look at you and throw you out a pair of shoes and a shirt and pants and so forth. And the only thing you could argue about was your shoe size. You could go try them on, and if they didn't fit, you could get changed, but the rest of them you lived with. And next thing probably is we started learning about inspections, especially in barrack inspections, and you'd have to, officer would come in, they'd call attention, and you had to stand by your bunk and have things out for inspection. And they'd drop a quarter on your bed. If it wasn't tight enough to bounce the quarter, why, you're in trouble. And I remember the old GI shoes, the high-top GI shoes they issued us. Everybody had to take GI soap and a big old scrub brush, and we scrubbed them for a day or two until we got all the paint and polish off of them, and then they would take a good shine, and they had to shine perfectly. Even after you had marched in them all day, you had to get them ready for the next day's inspection. Remember our first payday, I don't know how many thousand of us were lined up at the headquarters building or pay office and sitting in the hot sun waiting for your turn. And finally, after an hour or two, when you finally got there, I went in and I'd been redlined. And I said, "Sorry, but you didn't put your full middle name." And I said, "I don't have a full middle name, I only have the initial D." But that was too bad, so I had to wait till the next 2 weeks before I got paid, and I got caught up then. After that, I put IO, which is initial only, above my middle initial. The drill field was a humongous thing. I don't know how, like a mile square or something. It probably seemed awfully big to me, but it was very large. And wind would blow, the dirt would blow. It was completely, there's nothing but dirt and dust. And as the dust would erode the ground away, it was rocky too, and there'd be all these rocks laying around that you have a hard time marching. So every now and then they would call a halt, and they'd have an army of men that looked like a mile wide. We'd have to march the full length of that thing and gather up all the rocks, and then they'd stop you, and you'd have to all put your rocks down. So they had these big lines of rocks so that they'd go in on machinery and pick them up for the next day. And we really marched and drilled till we thought our feet would fall off, but we always had to have our gas mask on when we were taking drill instructions. And it was hot, and you'd have those gas masks on, and you'd sweat and steam in them, and some of the guys got smart. There's a rubber flapper in them. They found out they could take that rubber flapper out of them, and they could breathe pretty good, and they weren't nearly as hot. But it was always, I guess that nobody would ever say anything, but it always happened to the new groups that came in. One day we were marching, and they marched us over to the gas chamber and marched everybody through that gas chamber. And I'm telling you, those guys that had the flappers out of them come out of there spitting and sputtering, and they put them back in and never took them out again. Of course, we took calisthenics there every day, and they got us in pretty good shape, but it was a little bit different than I'd been used to. But they'd always take after you got done with calisthenics, you'd take a road run clear around this base out perimeter, and I think it was like 4 miles or more. And A lot of them bit the dust along the way, and they'd have to go haul them in. But at the one end of about halfway around, there's a big sewer ditch come out of the base, and I think it was just for the base. But it had big sloping sides down to it, and you had to get across that thing. Well, I'd been out for track at the University of Nebraska before I got in, and I was in pretty good shape. I could usually jump it, but I'd say about half of them could make it part of the time, and a few of them made it all the time, and some of them didn't even try. They'd just wade across with their shoes on. That night they had to get them dried out and all repolished and stuff, and they smelled, and it never changed that they had to wade through it every day that we went around. In the mess hall one time, I don't know, a lot of us started getting diarrhea and weren't feeling good, and so they had quite a checkup, and they finally found out that their dishwashers weren't working right, and they weren't getting the old soap off of the mess trays that we had. They got that cleaned up, and we all got better. I do remember that one day we went in and they had this good looking meat. It was kind of pink, and even the fat around it was pink colored, but they said told us it was horse meat. We could eat it if we wanted to, and I ate some, but it wasn't too bad. It was kind of stringy, but some of the city boys, they thought they were really pretty hot stuff, you know, and us little country kids, we were kind of sitting around in the corners, but they had card games going all the time, and the barracks chief, each barracks had a barracks chief. He had a little room in the corner, but he played poker with them and stuff the whole time we were there. They'd win and lose and win and lose, and just before we shipped out, we all got paychecks, and sure enough, the barracks chief even invited them into his quarters to play, and they played most of the night, and lo and behold, the next day we had a few guys hanging their heads. Those hot shots from the city played cards all night, and somewhere or another the barracks chief ended up with all their money, and they were broke and headed for shipping out with not a dollar in their pocket. They look over the cards, and they finally figured out that he had marked cards, but he cleaned them out, but there's nothing they could do. We were gone the next day, and so was their money. A few of them kind of hung their heads, but several of us loaned them $1 or $2 to get them through till the next payday at the next station. From Shepherd Field, Texas, we were shipped by troop train to Logan, Utah. That's where Utah State Agricultural College is. And we arrived there July 26th of '43, and we left October 7th of '43. From Shepherd Field to Logan, Utah. While there, we took mathematics, physics, history, civil air regulations, medical aid, military training, physical training, and we got our first flying. We got 10 hours in a Piper Cub, J3 Cub. Nobody was allowed to solo there. When we rolled into Logan, Utah, after basic training in Shepherd Field, Texas, and the heat and the dirt, we really all felt like we were kind of in paradise. Logan is located in the kind of the valley at the end of a big canyon called Wind Canyon in the mountains there. I think the altitude, if I remember right, is around 5,000 feet. There's a big mountain stream comes down this canyon and goes right by Logan. and they went up the canyon a long ways and built a big water aqueduct up along the side of the mountain, along the canyon wall. And it didn't have as much fall as the stream, so when it gets to Logan, it's sitting clear up on the side of the mountain there. So they have this fresh water, mountain water, that they run down through Logan for irrigation for the Ag College. And the city of Logan is kind of built on a long street, and the streets in Logan have gutters, and they run water down these curbs 24 hours a day, and everybody has a little floodgate in front of their home, and they can open this little floodgate and water their gardens or yards or whatever they want. It's a beautiful place. And in this stream, there's a lot of fishing. There were several dams built on it, and not real large dams, but just enough to make some beautiful mountain ponds. And you could get up on the side hills there and just see the great big trout down in there and fish. And the world's record brown trout was caught there. I do remember that. Some of the guys would sneak out at night, which really was a no-no in cadets. If you got caught, you were in big trouble. They'd sneak out and go in the fruit orchard and come in with apples and whatever was happening to be in season at the time. And we moved into a brand new girls' dorm. I guess it's been the guys ahead of us, but the girls never did get moved in it, and that was our barracks, and that was something pretty nice. You'd see the big cars come down out of the hills, monstrous cars. I don't know, the big old Packards or something, but there'd be a whole family of that looked like a dozen kids in there. They always said that those Mormons had several wives, and I believed it after that. This is an aerial view of the campus there. It was really laid out nice. It had this great big grass area, quadrangle they called it, where the sidewalks were going across, and all the main buildings were built around that square. And this, of course, is the main building right in front, and I think that's the library in back, and some other building. But then the smaller buildings were built in back of that. But it was really nice. This is a picture of our squadron taken in the bleachers at the football field. We used this quadrangle right there at the campus to do all our drills. We did a lot of marching and close order drill there. And sometime while you were there, they halted this whole group and singled you out. And you had to go out and stand in the middle of the place and march all 4 squadrons around, clear around that square. And I'll tell you, you're shaking your boots, but I got through it. A lot of the guys would have them marching into trees and everything, but I got them clear around and stopped, so I lucked out there. We did finally get some uniforms that fit a little better when we got up to Logan. This is what we'd all been waiting for, getting in an airplane. As I said before, we all got 10 hours. We couldn't solo, but it was quite an experience. Being just as up in the mountains at high altitude and gusty winds, all your flights were very rough. Now and then the wind would come down this canyon, storm would come up, and I wasn't ever up when it did that bad. But when I was out there and watched them sometime, the wind was blowing so hard, they would fly those cubs in and almost come straight down with them into the wind. They'd head them into the wind, and they'd almost come straight down. And there'd be about 4 guys out there, and they'd grab the wing struts as soon as it got down to the ground, and they had to walk them back into to tie them down so they didn't blow over. There's another shot. That's a different cub there. This is a shot of my pilot log. I only had 10 hours in it, but it was a lot of fun. I've kind of forgotten my serial number as an enlisted man, but it looked like 374-80089. I got a new one when I was discharged when I got my wings and got a commission. I was discharged as a private and went back in as an officer and got a new serial number. And I remember that one, 0-784858. Had to use that a lot. This is a copy of the certificate I got when I left Utah State Ag College. That was 9th of October 1943. This is another view of the campus from one cub, and there's a cub in the picture, but this is the campus, and you can see Wind Canyon where it starts right back up there and goes on up into the hills. If you look real closely, this is water aqueduct comes along up here, and then that's where it comes down and dumps into the stream down here, and it's carried down into the campus and into the city of Logan. This is the front of the girls' dorm where we stayed. When we had time off, we was always climbing up in the little mountains around there. This is horsing around. I think that's Bill Fenton, and John Bloomer pretending like he's about to slide down the mountain and he's saving him. Those guys are both from Lincoln. Bill Fenton, I guess maybe I said, was killed in a jet crash. He joined the Air Guard in Lincoln, and he was killed south of Lincoln in a jet crash. And this is another guy I got quite friendly with. His name was John Campbell, and he was from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I should try to look him up and see if he's still alive. Of course, we took a lot of phys ed up there, and that was a real rude awakening. The first time they got us out there on the football field and then put us on the track, and I don't know how far they told us to run, but what I mean, that altitude was a shocker. We finally kind of got over it before we left, but we're not really completely. Yeah, we did have an obstacle course there too that we had to run every day, or every time we went out for phys ed. Like I said, we did finally get some better fitting clothes, and we had to look sharp all the time or we were gigged, and that didn't help your chances in cadets. There's one last shot of Logan Canyon. You can see that beautiful stream, and there's the water aqueduct coming right down right up there again. I remember now I remember the last part of it. They tunneled through the mountain there. And down here, I think, if I remember right, that was our water treatment plant for drinking water. Cadet training at that time, they were really tough on us. I mean, we called it chicken shit stuff, but boy, they were really after you. We had a sergeant in charge of our dorm there, or the girls' dorm. His name I'll never forget. It was Sergeant Provenzano. And I know one night we stayed up all night with toothbrushes scrubbing the floor in that place. And I met up with him later on. I'll tell you about that when I get there. I think that was at Kingman, Arizona. Okay, when we left Logan, we were shipped down to Santa Ana, California, from Logan down to Santa Ana, which is in Orange County, just outside of LA. That was for classification. We took all kinds of tests, and they classified you either a pilot, a bombardier, or a navigator, or you got washed out. We lost about half of the cadets right there at classification. At Santa Ana, it was kind of 3 months of really stressful because you'd gone so far and you knew what was at stake here. You knew that a high percentage of the guys would be washed out. Plus, you might not get your shot at the thing you wanted to do, as being a pilot, navigator, or bombardier. Of course, I wanted to be a pilot, and that doesn't always happen. That's the reason for all the tests. We had about 3 months of all kinds of tests and everything. I'll kind of mention a few of them. And also, if you washed out with all the tests you'd taken, why, they knew pretty well what you were qualified. And the big story was if you washed out, you were going to cook and baker school, and that was always the threat over your head. Of course, you had a good shot at gunner if you didn't make pilot, bombardier, or navigator. We talked to all different types of people from shrinks on down, and they were just interview after interview, but they wanted to know everything about you. Of course, the main thing, they want to know whether you want to be a pilot, navigator, or bombardier, and why. And some of the shrinks would want to know everything about you, your sex life, your religion, and you name it. I mean, it was just one after another. And as you went to answer all these, you was trying to figure out in your mind how to answer them, what was going to do you the best, or what would hurt you the most. Of course, one question was, what kind of plane do you want to fly if you are a pilot? And before he let me answer it, he says, I'm just looking at you, you want to fly a P-38, and that was my dream, and that's where I was headed out of advanced until the P-38s didn't do quite as good in combat, and they were cutting back on them and getting more P-51s, so they closed. I think it was at Williams Airfield in Arizona where I would have gone, but they cut that program out, so that was the end of that. I don't imagine you can imagine how it would take 3 months to give you tests, but I'm telling you, they had buildings full of stuff and people asking you questions and taking exams. A lot of physics questions. A lot of times they would have drawings of gears on shafts with V-belts on them, and they'd show you which direction the gear was going on one end. They wanted to tell them what direction the gear was on the other end when it come out. They checked you on hearing to no end. They had night vision tests where you'd put you in this dark room and flash a screen, and you'd supposedly see some little something, and if you didn't see it, why your night vision wasn't very good. And they gave it to you 2 or 3 times, as I remember, and hopefully that you would improve. Well, I kind of caught on to it. If you'd kind of catch it out of the corner of your eye, you could see them better. And then afterwards, the 3 tests, I think it was, then they told you how to do it, and they checked you again to see how well you did, whether the ones that didn't get it could improve, or whether some of them didn't see them, never did see them. And they had machines and checks for peripheral vision, see how good you were at that. I mean, I guess that's quite an item, but I didn't suppose that people differed, but they must, because they sure tested you. They had pages and pages of true and false questions, and you take your best shot at them. You never know how you come out, but it must have been all right. Then they had one whole room of all kinds of dexterity things, like putting the square blocks in the round holes and the round holes in the square blocks and all that kind of stuff. But this whole room, you went clear around it doing all these things, and then they'd let you do them again and see if you could improve on them the second time you did them. But you spent hours in there on all this stuff. And one of them that I really remember, that was in another room. They went in this room and they had the whole room was lined with, looked like metal turning lathes. All they were, the bed and the motor and stuff. And what they did, they took you had two handles, you know, on a metal turning lathe to control a cutting tool. And one handle turns it in and out, and the other handle turns it sideways, so you crank them to when you're using a metal turning lathe. Rather than a workpiece up here, they had a flat round disc. It just looked about like a old 78 turntable, and on that turntable they had a round circle out towards one edge, and it was copper. And in this tool holder, they had a copper wire that went out and would sit right on that brass button there, their copper button. And then they'd turn on the turntable, which would move around real slowly, and you were supposed to turn the cranks and keep that wire on that copper spot. Well, that looked like a piece of cake, but they said, okay, go. And you grab those two things. What do you know? But they had left-hand threads on them. And I'm telling you, I was all over the place. I thought, man, I really flunked that one. But later on, we did talk to some guys that knew what was going on there, worked there and so forth. And they says, well, that's not really the case. They were wanting to know whether you were mechanically minded and done enough that kind of work that you knew the right-hand threads and left-hand threads where they normally go in or out. And so they said some guys that could do it pretty good, they knew they didn't have that ability. And of course, airplanes, everything was set up to be done normally in bomb sites and whatever. So that kind of relieved my mind a little bit. We did have, I don't remember, not a lot, but some written things we had to write, and that worried me the most, because I'm a poor speller and that was not my cup of soup, but I gave them a shot. Yeah, the old chicken shit stuff went on. I mean, I think they were pushing some of the older guys, they couldn't handle it, and they just give her up and blow their cork and go, but they kept pushing you all the time. Also, there they made you go down and get your hair cut once a week, so you're really trimmed up. It cost you, if I remember right, $1.50, and we got to timing them, and it was always between a minute and a minute and a half that they took to cut your hair when they'd have the guys in there, and they had a real racket going, because I don't know how many thousand guys were there, and they raked in a lot of dough. Somebody was getting a good cut. Yeah, while we were there, we took a lot of PE. We played a lot of flag football. I mean, they kept us busy. And also, we did hours and hours of aircraft recognition. They'd put you in the dark room and have this screen up there and flash silhouettes of different airplanes, from Japanese and German airplanes, by the hour. And you had a little, you sit in the chair and it had a little keyboard there, and you were supposed to punch the right keyboard for whichever plane went by. And I got to know them pretty good, but I couldn't tell you one of them anymore. I can't even remember the names of them anymore. I certainly wished I'd have done this 50 or 60 years ago, what I'm doing now, and I could have remembered quite a few details. I don't remember how long after we got done we had to sit around and wait for results, but I guess it came out all right for me. But we was really amazed at the guys that washed out that you thought were top notch, and but they didn't make it. So I guess they had the reasons for in their system for picking who they wanted to do what. But I got my classification as pilot, and I thank the good Lord for that one.
From Santa Ana, we went on down to Tucson, Arizona, and we went down there for primary flight training at Ryan Airfield. Ryan is right outside of Tucson. Going back to Santa Ana just for a second, I forgot that we did get to go into LA two or three times, and we thought we'd go down to see if we could get into the Frank Sinatra radio show one night in Hollywood. And we got there, and there was like 2 blocks long of about 10 wide girls lined up in a holler and trying to get in. So we knew we didn't have a shot at that. And oh, we did go to Coconut Grove, and that was quite a thrill to see that show there. By golly, I walked up to the bar and I run into a guy from my hometown of Elmwood. It was Bill James. Kind of shocked him when I tapped him on the shoulder, but that's kind of 1 in a million shot. I'll start this out with a few pictures to kind of give you the feeling where we were at. This is Ryan Field, and I counted something between 30 and 40 planes there. And you can see the mountains in the background. There's always several ranges of mountains, low mountains, but then they had all these valleys in between that were desert until they cleaned them off. The field here was one great big blacktop slab, and we'd land on one half of it and take off on the other half of it. There was a sweet little airplane. I just loved those. Sure would like to have one. Each class at Ryan, when you graduated, you got a booklet that shows all the crews and everything about the place. But we were class 44G. That means our class will graduate in the year 44, and we're the G class to get out, which would be in August of 44. Doesn't that look like fun? We were in Squadron 5. Of course, that's me. That's William R. Brand, our instructor. I want you to notice how big a man he is, about 300 pounds, I think. This is John Carroll. I got quite close to him. This is E.J. Cunningham. Now, he was a second lieutenant, and he transferred from some other division into the Air Corps to go through pilot training. This is Barr and Bill Barnett. I'd forgotten that John Bloomer from Lincoln went to primary with me, but I didn't see much of him because he was in a different squadron. But that's John Bloomer from Lincoln right there. This is a nice 8x10 photograph that we got of our instructor and our gang that he taught us how to fly. He was a big man. He had a little wife that weighed about, good-looking little wife that weighed about 100 pounds. They invited us this group into their house for dinner one night before we graduated. We had a graduation dance, and any of the people that happen to have friends or family close enough got to go to it. Of course, most of us didn't. The officers and cadets of the 11th Army Air Force Flying Training Detachment, Ryan School of Aeronautics of Arizona, request the pleasure of your attendance at a graduation dance honoring Class 44G to be given Friday, the 10th of March at the Blue Moon Ballroom from 8 to 11:30 o'clock. Present for admission. Formal. This is the Ryan PT-22 that's at the Confederate Air Force in Brownville, Texas, at the airport at Brownville.
Okay, you got the Ryan PT-22. Specifications. Wingspan is 30 feet. Length is 26 feet 10. Gross weight was 1825. Empty weight was 1278. Wing area is 134.25 square feet. Engine was a Kenner. It's 165 horsepower. Performance maximum speed was 128. Cruise speed 116. Landing was 54. Rate of climb 680 feet per minute. Surface ceiling was 14,800. Its range was 325 miles. Took a crew of 2. The instructor flew from the rear seat. The student was in the front.
Another kid and I tried to see how high we could get with ours one day. I bested him a little bit. I got a little over 13,000, but ours were pretty tired in those days. Try it one more time. Sorry about that.
Okay, it's Ryan PT-22 Recruit. Came from the company that produced the Spirit of St. Louis and the first low-wing trainer of over 100 horsepower to be accepted by the Army Air Corps, and it became the PT-22 primary trainer. The PT-22 was a descendant of the famous ST-1 sport monoplane. 22s featured a 65 horsepower radial engine that provided outstanding climbing ability. It had an excellent rate of roll performance that brought acceptance by the U.S. Army Air Corps in 1941. Thousands of pilots took their first flight in the PT-22 and then graduated to the BT-13, 15, or AT-6 advanced trainers. This PT-22 is furnished in the original pre-1942 paint theme and markings. Only 1,048 of the PT-22 aircraft were built. 25 served with the Dutch Air Force as training and scout aircraft. This 22 flies with the Confederate Air Force Training Command as it did with the AAF in the late 1930s and throughout World War II. Yep.
Ryan Field was just outside of Tucson, Arizona. I don't know whether you've ever heard of Old Tucson. It's a kind of a tourist attraction of old Western buildings and stuff, but at that time it had been an old movie set, and all there was old half adobe walls sticking up there, but it was right near it. We'd take off and we flew right over it, very close to where Ryan Field was. We, of course, came from the train station out to the Ryan Field in an old Army school bus type, and the closer we got to it, we were hanging our heads out the window and looking, and sure enough, we could see all these little planes up in the sky. The closer we got, it just looked like a bunch of bumblebees buzzing around, and what I mean, we were all pretty bunch of excited kids, and thinking that we were going to be part of that pretty soon. The old chicken shit stuff never did cease, but you were supposed to conduct yourselves as officers and gentlemen, of course, in that training. And first night at mess hall, it was set up pretty nice. They had long tables, and of course you had your mess trays and stuff, but I'll take it back. Maybe we had dishes there, I can't remember. But anyway, you marched in and stood at attention and sat down together and everything. And then the cooks or somebody brought food in bowls and served it to you, and they'd set the bowl down and send it around the table, and everybody'd take their fair share and go from there. But well, all the guys got in there and we were all hungry. Of course, I was down at the wrong end of the table, and they started the bowls around, and probably about a third of us didn't get anything to eat. The rest of them had taken it all. We sat there a little while, and I don't know, we started complaining a little bit, and that was a no-no. The sergeant that was in charge there, he let us know that you don't do that in cadets, and gave us the business. Well, I think maybe if we'd have shut up, they would have brought us some food, but we said something, so believe it or not, we were on KP the first night in there. We went all night till breakfast without anything to eat. And I'll tell you, after that, everybody dished out food and was pretty careful with it and got it around and then kind of divided up from the rest of the time we were there. Each instructor down at Ryan had 5 students, and instructors were civilian. Our instructor was W.R. Brand, and he weighed 300 pounds if he weighed a pound. I mean, he wasn't any taller than I am, but he could barely wiggle into that cockpit when he got in. And he was a very nice gentleman, and I really enjoyed him. And believe it or not, after I don't know how many, I've forgotten how many hours, but he says, "Okay, take it around," you know, for my solo flight, and I was the first one out of our 5, which made me kind of proud. But anyway, boy, I wheeled her out there and took off, and we just made a circle around the field and land. I took off and went around the field, made my base leg approximately where we'd been making it, while distance out from the field as we'd always been doing, and cut the old engine, started gliding by glide path, and boy, the old thing was just floating like a kite up there, and I was probably, I'm just guessing, 300 feet high. The pattern was 500, and I was probably down to about 300 when I should have been on the ground. And so, well, what do? I poured on the gas and went around again, and this time I went way out farther on my base leg, and well, this'll do her. And got the power, and here I come, and that time I'm guessing 100 feet over the field. I looked down there, I could just see him laughing his head off down there. And the third time I went around, I went way out, flew her down to the cactus, and crossed the fence and cut the throttle and come in and taxied in, and he was just really having a ball. He says that happens to every one of his students, the first one that solos. He says, "I was just getting ready to go get the shotgun and shoot you down." Now I'll try to remember a few instances here, that interesting things, the things that I remembered, so they must have stuck in my mind. I don't remember much anymore, but we'd get check rides, and they had an officer on the field, or 2, I believe, 2 pilots that were officers that gave the check rides. But they were Army pilots. They weren't very happy about being there doing that, but anyway, I don't know. Never figured it out to this day, but he took me up. I did did all the things I was supposed to do, the aerobatics and whatever, and he said, "All right," he rattled that, he has a lot of those guys, they'll rattle that stick between her leg and just wrap you in the leg, and he says, "I got her." And he was not very high altitude. I wish I could remember. I know it might, at the time he did it, it was really low. But he did hammerhead stalls, if you know what those were. He'd dive it and get it going real fast, and then pull it up and go straight up in the air, and it would drop straight down on his tail. And then he'd pull it out. But he was dangerously low. And he did about a dozen of those. I don't know whether it was purposely to see if he could make me sick or make me say uncle or what, but I sat there and held my breath and got all done with that, and he said, "I'll take her back," and we did, but he got out and never said a word, but that was one I'll never forget. And we were, of course, after we soloed, we were out flying around all by ourselves all the time, and there was a big railroad bridge out in the desert that went over a little stream, And every place you went, there was always something the guys had going that you weren't part of the gang until you did it. But if you got caught, you took that chance of getting washed out of cadets. Well, I worried about that more than anything, so I never did do it. But one day the base commander got a letter from the railroad, or a telephone call, and he says, "You're going to have to quit using that railroad bridge for training," he says, "because we're going to put scaffolding under it." But the guys would get watch and make sure there's nobody around, and they'd fly under that railroad bridge, which wasn't very high and wasn't very wide. But that ended that for sure. We'd go to the mess hall in the morning, and when you left, a lot of times they had fruit for you to take out, and they had oranges there. Real strange, but the oranges would all disappear. Everybody would take a couple or three and put them in their flight suit down in the leg pockets in their flight suit, and we'd get up and we'd go out in the desert and we'd find some farmhouse or ranch house out there, and a lot of them weren't real plush, you know, and they'd have outside toilets, so we'd take turns getting 2 or 3 of us in a row, and we'd dive down and dive bomb and try to hit them with oranges when we went by. Now and then we'd get somebody to run out of them, but not too often. After I soloed, wasn't too long after, man, I thought I was the hottest pilot in the country, and I had been up for a flight, and I landed it and taxied in and whipped it into a parking stall, or it lined them up in rows. I guess you saw in that picture earlier. I whipped it in there and I ground looped that puppy, went around, clear around and back around, and I don't know whether nobody saw me or what, but I never heard about it. But I came very close to wiping out two other planes beside mine. But boy, I got that thing parked and I got out of there right now. We had another test pilot that took me up for a check ride, and the old Ryans, you didn't have any communication except they had a little funnel up in the front, and you had, and when just a tube went back to, you had a headset on, and it was just actually hoses came back, and he'd talk into that funnel, and you could hear him pretty good. But this guy that took me up for the test ride had me do all the maneuvers and aerobatics and the whole bit, but the whole time he sat up there with his hand outside of the cockpit drumming that funnel on the side of the plane, and the wind blowing in it, and they did everything they could to give you a hard time, it seemed like. I guess maybe I mentioned before that another kid and I, we made up our mind we got way out, see how high we could get those little things, and I bested him a little bit by, well, I gave up, but I mean, I was over 13,000 feet with that little old thing, and but they were pretty tired, some of them, but that looked, you can see a lot of distance from up there. We was always trying something. And, like I say, we really never learned how to fly until we started aerobatics, and that was really, you learned the plane and how to get out of stalls, and you'd stall it 100 times, and you just it was a good way to really learn, and that's when I felt that I really had learned a lot with the aerobatics. Anybody can take it off and fly it straight. It's a little harder to land it, but really to understand flying in the plane, the aerobatics does it. The time we were there, we'd get to go into Tucson now and then, and at that time it was only 40,000 people, just kind of like a little cow town down there, and we enjoyed it. There was a Blue Moon dance hall. It was kind of a hangout for cadets and women that were around in Tucson, but that's about the only place to go, and we did go there quite a bit, and that's where our graduation dance was held. Well, let's see, what else? Oh, when we did graduate,
they lined us up. We were all at attention out on the field, and they had the governor of Arizona come out and give us a little speech. Well, about that time the wind came up and the dust and dirt and sand was blowing, and he was telling us, all us guys, that when you get out of the service and come home, he says, we want you to come back to Arizona, to the land of enchantment. Well, we really hooted and thought that'd be the last place on earth that we'd ever want to go back to, but we should have gone back and bought some land right after the war, because it sure did grow. It was pretty darn, guess one other thing I thought about, it was pretty darn cold, and we wore those old leather flying suits with sheep-lined flying suit, big old heavy clumsy things, but I'll tell you, it got pretty darn chilly some mornings when it was about down to freezing and out there in the desert, and you were riding in that back cockpit. The old wind really whistled through there. Of course, all these places we were at, we took a lot of ground school at the same time. I mean, we were taking classes when we weren't flying, and PT, or physical education, and still did a little bit of drilling, not a lot anymore after we were flying, but we did some. I don't know what happened to all those Ryans, but I suppose they scrapped a lot of them, but I did see 3 or 4 of them at the Oshkosh at the air show there, and then this one down here at Brownville. But I really fell in love with that plane. It would really be nice to have one. While we were there, maybe you noticed on that windsock booklet we got from there, that booklet was dedicated to Edward J. Healy. He was the one cadet that was killed while I was there. As you can see, I fell in love with cadet haircuts too. I've worn them all my life, except for when I was courting my wife, and I guess it worked out, because she's the best thing that ever happened to me since the service. And then after I got her hooked, well, then I started shaving it off again. This folder contains all the flying records, my hours and so forth, from the time I started primary until I was discharged. This is at Ryan Field at Tucson, where we're still talking about. It shows PT 22. I had 195 landings. Student dual time, 29 hours and 11 minutes. And student first pilot time, 35 hours and 49 minutes. And instrument training in the link trainer was 5 hours and 5 minutes. So that was a total of 65 hours and 10 minutes I had at Ryan. We shipped out from Ryan. It really didn't ship out. We went by the regular old school buses again to Marana Field, which was about 30 miles northwest of Tucson. It wasn't a very long trip. If you go by there, you'll see there's kind of located by Picacho Peak, and it wasn't far from there. It had a pretty large base, but we got in there on 11th of March of 44, and we left there on the 23rd of May, 1944. That's for basic flight training. Don't have hardly any pictures and so forth, 2 or 3 here, but I saw this postcard I sent home. Never mentioned the big saguaro cactus with our little planes, that was, we were really worried about having to sit down with a crash landing or try to crash land them, because these suckers were all over. This is desert. The only place that was cleared out is where we had the airfields. And these are big old saguaro cactus. They would get as high as 50 feet high, and they'd live 200 years. But those suckers would tear up a plane. They were big and heavy. This is a picture of a BT-13, which we flew there in flight. Not very good, but I'll tell you more about the plane a little later on. This is some of our group in front of the planes that we flew. Basically, if you know what an AT-6 is, advanced trainer, this is the same, very similar plane, except it does not have a retractable gear, and it had a 450 horsepower engine, whereas the AT-6 had a 650 horsepower engine. I don't know how I got to be front center there. There is John Campbell, the only one still with me, I think, that I know of, buddy, right there. This is the group I trained with there at Marana. I don't remember what they called them, squadrons or what, but this is a gang of guys. I, of course, knew them all, but really was never real close to any of them. It seemed like we were awfully busy there. I do remember Willie Crosland, mainly because we heard later that he got through advanced and went to B-24s, and B-24 he was training in blew up and he was killed. The BT-13 was really a big airplane compared to what we'd been used to. Cubs and little Ryan PT-22s. It was a big, heavy metal airplane and two-passenger. And you walked up to that thing and you're a 19-year-old kid. Let's see, it was a 19 there, I guess so by then. It was something to look at and made you kind of wonder. We hadn't been to basic too long, and they called us all into a great big room, or our whole squadron. And they made the whole squadron count off 1 through 10, you know, 1 through 10, 1 through 10, until they all had a number. Then they said all of the 1 through 4s go to one side of the room, and all of them 6 through 10 go to the other side of the room. And they said, all right, gentlemen, they said, 1 year from today, according to the statistics, all of those on the 1 through 4 side will be dead. And so this is your last chance. We will let you transfer out if you want to, and to go talk to some guy. But they were kind of pointing out the statistics to us. But in those days we were young and we knew that nothing could happen to us. So I didn't know of anybody that disappeared that I knew of, but there could have been. Marana was quite a large air base and a lot of planes. I used to know the number, but it's in several hundred airplanes that they had. So we had quite a group in the air. And the flying field was the same as at Ryan, a huge square blacktop
tarmac that you landed on one half of it and took off on the other side of it. And so there was a lot of traffic. This wasn't quite like the other primary. Here you had, didn't always get this, a lot of the times you'd get the same instructor, but from day to day you'd have different instructors, so they all taught a little different and had different ideas, and some of them were easy to get along with and some were son of a gun, so you really kind of had to stay on your toes. At Marana, I was the first one to solo out of our group, and the guy told me to take her around. And of course there we had radios and everything, and so I taxied out to the end of the runway and I called in and said this was 7's 005 or something, ready for solo takeoff. And the guy in the tower just chewed my butt, and he wouldn't quit because I says 00 instead of 00, and he just kept at it and kept at it and kept at it, and finally he told me to take off. But after I got back, my instructor said he was on his way down there. He didn't know what was going on, why I wouldn't take off. You know, a lot of times they'll go out on a solo and they'll freeze at the end of the runway and won't go, but I took off and soloed all right. But boy, when I got back and told him what happened, he came unglued and he headed for that tower, and I guess he said he really read off that tower operator. He said, when I send a man out to solo and then you put him through that, why. But I guess it all came out all right. There's no repercussion from it. But I didn't ever say anymore, I can tell you that. Now I'll just tell you some of the things that I remember. They won't be in any order or anything, but I just happened to think about the first cross country I took. I would say the first triangular cross country. You'd fly out to one auxiliary field and fly to another auxiliary field and then back to the base. They called it a triangular cross country. And so I took off and made it to the first landing field and landed. Everything went fine, and so I took off on the second leg to the second field, and I got up and that old plane started missing and sputtering and coughing. It kept going, but it just was really running rough and poking out a little smoke. And so I called into the base ahead, and they said, well, where I was, and I was closer to the second base, so they says, bring it on in. And I got there, and rather than fly the pattern like we normally do, they cleared the area and says, make a straight in approach. Well, I wasn't used to that, and I didn't know how far out I was and where to set my base leg, which I didn't have one. I came straight in, but sure enough, I was too high, and got down there, and I was too high, so I had to go around. But I poured the cops to it, and it run fine, and I went on around and come back in and landed. And of course, I got chewed out on those that had a canopy that just slid back. And you never made a landing without opening the canopy, because that was a no-no. I goofed there, because if it crashed or something, they would jam and they couldn't get you out of them. But I told them how bad it was rough it was running, and so they called back to the base and they wanted to know the plane number and so forth. And they said, well, that plane is not supposed to fly at that altitude. It's real tired, and the second leg was at a higher altitude, and they said, that plane won't run at that altitude. So they said, well, get in it and go on home then. They said, just stay down at the other altitude. So I went home, but a lot of those planes were really tired. So I was working in the engineering department at Goodyear, Tire and Rubber in Lincoln after the war. And I don't know, I was in one day talking to the purchasing agent there, and I'd heard that he had been a pilot, so we were shooting the fat, and I don't know, I told him I had been at Marana. Well, he had too, you know, and so we visited, and we were talking about cross countries, and I said, well, the story they always told us there before we took off on a cross country, I said, don't do like this one guy did that we had here.
said he took off and he missed his first field, and he kept flying, he kept flying, and kept flying. He got clear down into Mexico, and he just wasn't smart enough to. I really was landed on, and he wasn't smart enough to turn around until he about run out of gas, and he finally set it down there someplace. And I says then they had to go down and take it apart and haul it home. Found him, and this guy grinned and he says, "You know who that was?" And I said, "No," and he said, "It was me." And so we had something kind of common bond there. That was a 1 in a million happening. Of course, we had radios there, and we used radio navigation with beams and so forth to locate yourself. But on your radio beams, they would give an A and an N signal, and then every so often that would break into that, and they would give some code letters of a station, and that's where you'd find your location. But anyway, we had to learn code. Boy, I had a tough time. I don't remember how many words a minute we had to take, but I really struggled with that, but I made it. I think it was 15 words a minute, something like that you had to take. But that was tough, and I'd lay awake all night trying to practice code in my head. Yeah, I guess I can talk a little bit about navigation now. Of course, the easy one was just to look at your map and find objects and cities and towns and so forth like that, and we did that. We did it out a few times with instructors, and he would just see how we did. And he said, and finally, he says, if everything else fails, he says, find a village or a railroad track, and they'll always have a water tower, and on one of these little towns, fly down and get the name off of the water tower. By chance, right there by Marana, there was a railroad went by there, and there was an old wooden water tower there, and so we buzzed the thing, and he says that's the way to do it, and read the name off of it. But I was by there just a few years ago on the highway, and sure enough, that old water tower was still sitting there. I couldn't believe it. I must be keeping it for a relic, because it was a wooden one right along the highway and the railroad track. Of course, nowadays they can just lock on to a signal. It'll point the compass, and all you do is follow it in. But in those days they had radio beams. They would send out a cross signal, and one of them would transmit an N, which is a dot dash, and the other one would send out an A, which is a dash dot. So where those beams, these sections in here would get together, where they'd come match together, then the A and the N would get together, and that would be a solid signal. So you could tell where these 4 quadrants were. You could fly into it and find one of them if you were an N section, and then go into that beam. And you could fly through that beam and make a turn and come back and follow the beam, get on the beam. You could keep going one side or the other and stay on that beam. And then you'd have to turn your radio down to, you could barely hear the signal, and keep flying on that beam. And if the beam got louder, you know you're headed for the station. If you lost a signal, you knew you were going away from it. So if you're going away from it, you turn around and keep flying till you got into that station, and you'd fly in till you got right over it, and then you could look on your map and get the call letter of that station off your map, and you could find yourself on the map. And that's the way we located ourselves. That's the only navigation we had in those days. But that took quite a bit of practice on that. We'd go up and practice instruments and for an hour or so, and then they'd say take you home, but somewhere or another the instructor would always get you out over the Gila Bend area, and that would really file you up, because there was some kind of magnetic things going out there in the mountains that split up those radio beams, and they were split all to pieces, and they would really have a ball with you, because you just couldn't handle that one. On flying instruments, that was our first taste of it there. And of course we had link trainers that kind of started in there, where it was like a little airplane up on a pedestal, and you'd get in it and it would fly. You had the radio signals, you had everything, and outside of it was a guy on a desk with a machine that would track and plot your course exactly what you did. So they would make you go through this radio processes and flying the beams and bracketing them and coming in and then getting your heading for home and all that kind of stuff. Plus you could do your turns and stalls and spins and everything simulated in that link trainer. But then you'd go out and you'd be in the back seat, and either instructor in the front, or as soon as we got a little more proficient at it, well, we'd take turns with different cadets in the front. And you'd go out and practice instruments like steep turns and everything else, I mean, and they'd always told us about vertigo, but we didn't know, of course, didn't know what it was, or didn't assume we wouldn't ever get it. But it wasn't too long, and I was doing a series of steep turns and reversing them, and all of a sudden a darn seat belt started tugging at me, and lo and behold, the gravel was flying up off of the bottom of the old plane up at me, and what's going on? Well, I was clear over my back and didn't know it, and this kid, he was up there laughing, and the other was watching. But it's something that's real tough to get over, and to this day, I think at least 9 out of 10 of your small aircraft crashes that you see are people that don't have instrument training, and they don't think that they think they can fly anywhere, but they get vertigo and just crash and fly them into the ground. You can get a small sensation of vertigo a lot of times when you're just driving in the mountains and you lose the horizon, and maybe sometimes you think you're going downhill, but your old car's pulling down and you're going uphill. That's a very mild case of it, but it's a tough one to get over. In England, we were flying, you would get it sometimes, because a lot of times we were flying between two cloud formations with no horizon. They just blend together, and you'd get it, and well, you can shake your head and shut your eyes and a few things, but we were in tight formation and stuff, so maybe the other pilot would take over and you can kind of shut your eyes and get cleared of it, and then you're all right again. But it's dangerous, and it's tough, and you've got, when you're flying instruments, you have to learn to believe the instruments and fight it, and you can do it, but it takes practice, and that's why people that should keep very proficient on instruments that are doing any kind of flying. The other the pilot on our crew, Bert Ward, he was a little older, but and he knew it all, but he was a good pilot and a good crew commander. But he says, I've never had vertigo in my life. And one time we were coming back from a raid over Germany, and we were letting down in England. I can tell you how we did that later, but we let down into that, and we had to go down at a certain speed and a certain rate of descent. And all of a sudden he started veering off to the right, and I hollered at him, Bert, where you going? Bert, where you going? And he shook that thing around, and he got it straightened out, but I mean, we'd lost our approach, so we had to go back up through that, which was very dangerous. I'll tell you about that later. But after that, he didn't say he'd never had vertigo. While we were at Marana, they had a squadron of Chinese cadets over there learning how to fly. And one day it was pretty windy and the planes were coming in. This buddy of mine, he came in and set her down. There was a pretty good crosswind. This Chinese cadet, he came down and hit
about ballooned up in the air, and the crosswind picked him up and come over, and he come down right on top of my buddy's plane. The propeller cut the plane in two pieces right behind his head, and the plane set out on the field like that, with the nose sitting up like that and the tail laying here, and my buddy was just about on the ground down here where this was set. Yeah, it was a close one, but they went out and got him out of it. Went out with a wrecker and picked up one half the plane, hauled it in, went out and picked up the other half and hauled it in. And they took him in, and they put him in another airplane and made him take off again and have a little flight. I don't know whether I don't think anybody went with him. But they said that's the way they had to do it. They said if he'd sat around and thought about it, he probably wouldn't have ever flown again. But he got over it and went on through training and got through all right. One day we were all out taking phys ed there at Marana. We was kind of out over at the end of the field, and the pattern was the base leg was right over and approach right over where we were taking phys ed. And the wind came up and switched, and I guess you understand this base leg deal. Like they were going to come in here and land. You fly down one side, and then your base leg is over to where, and then you start your approach in. Well, it'd be a right hand or left hand pattern. They'd tell you on the radio what kind of pattern it was. So anyway, say this day they were coming in this direction, and the wind changed, and they changed it from another. I don't see how did they changed it from a right-hand pattern to a left-hand pattern. So you should be coming down this side and coming in here and in. Well, everybody that could understand English switched and were coming this way, and here come the Chinese cadets in the other way. You've never seen such a zoo in your life with those planes coming in at each other and peeling off and going all kinds of directions, but they all made it through it, but it was something to see. Of course, we did a lot of aerobatics here, and these were bigger, more powerful planes, and we were really enjoying them, but the only one problem with them, they had a gravity-fed carburetor, and you could do barrel rolls and loops and a few things, but you couldn't stay upside down but a little bit, then it wouldn't get gas and it would cut out. So that was always a problem as far as flying upside down for any distance. You had to you couldn't hold her there very long, so most of our maneuvers had to be upside down for a little while. Every air base you went to, somebody had figured out something to do that you shouldn't be doing. Right near Marana was, they called it Picacho Peak. It was a double set of peaks, and they had a red light up on each one of the peaks, and there was a huge wire that ran clear from one peak to the other, I guess for the light, but everybody says you were supposed to fly under that. I never did see anybody do it, but they claimed, a lot of them claimed they were doing it, but I think they put those stories out just to try to get somebody to do it, but anyway, that was the one they had going there at Marana. Of course, all these places we were at, we were always taking all kinds of ground school, weather. We took a lot of weather, and even some first aid, and I mean, all kinds of flying theory and you name it. But they kept us busy, I'll tell you that, because we were really a crash course for pilot training. One other thing I was thinking, the BT-13 was a real noisy aircraft, but it had the gear on them stood pretty high. They stood up pretty high in the air. Like, one of the reasons for it was so they could have a large propeller on them. But if you change the propeller pitch to a low pitch for takeoff, I guess they had standard, they're automatic on some of those, but actually when you had that low pitch, they would wind up real fast,
and the tip of this propeller would reach the speed of sound, and that's what made the noise. It wasn't the airplane engine and so forth. It was actually the propeller tips. And you look at every one of those propeller tips out there, and there's a million little fine hairline cracks right in the very outer edge of that propeller. And they said it was nothing to worry about, but they were caused by the speed of those tips reaching the speed of sound. To start the BT-13, they had a flywheel up under the cover there someplace. You'd get up on the wing. One guy'd have to get a big crank he'd put in there, and you'd crank that and crank it until you get that flywheel turning, and then the pilot, he would engage it, and that flywheel would kick the engine over to start it. From Tucson, basic flight training, we went down to Douglas, Arizona, which wasn't too far for advanced flight training. From Tucson down to Douglas, which was right on the border. On the other side of the border was a little Mexican town of Agua Prieta. We went down there a few times, but there wasn't too much to do there. We got into Douglas on the 23rd of May and graduated from advanced flight school in August 4th of '44, and we got our wings in commission. I forgot to give the hours that I got at basic flight training. I had 126 landings. Student dual time, I had 28 hours and 35 minutes. And I had 30 minutes of night flying. And student first pilot time, I had 37 hours and 20 minutes and 5 hours and 50 minutes night flying. I'd forgotten to tell you, we did do a little bit of our first night flying there. So I had 78 hours and 59 minutes there. So my total flying hours are up to 137 hours and 15 minutes. After basic flight training, you didn't know where you were going, whether you were going to single engine or multi-engine advanced. And I don't know whether the fact that I'd put in for P-38s were multi-engine maybe influenced that I went to multi-engine advanced training or not, but I'm glad it ended up the way it went. So that was another thing that you were kind of on edge, want to know where you were going to go. At Douglas, that was the first field that actually had a runway like a regular airfield, not a huge tarmac, and it had lighted runway, not the best in the world, but it was lighted. And so from there we started flying, and there you didn't actually really solo. You went up with an instructor for quite a while, and pretty soon you were proficient, so you just started having other cadets fly with you, so there really wasn't any actual solo great big deal there. And multi-engine, we'd got our feet pretty well wet on flying, and multi-engine didn't amount to much, except we had to learn all the procedures for twin engines and all the procedures and emergency procedures for twin engines and so forth. That was a big deal of the actual flying skills that you learned there.
Here at Douglas, we flew the AT-17s, which stood for an Advanced Trainer number 17. It was built by Cessna, and it was they call it the Cessna Bobcat. His nickname was the Bamboo Bomber because it had fabric covering on most of the plane, and it had a lot of wooden structure in it. It had 2 radial engines on it. Since I've been home, I've only seen 2 of them. Two of them. Let's see. No, I'll take it back. One of them at Oshkosh at their big air show up there. And let's see, where was the other one? Oh, I think it was in some museum down in Tucson. But that's the only 2 that I know of at all. They weren't many of them kept, I don't imagine, because there had been an awful lot of maintenance on them, and everybody went for the metal airplanes, especially in the twin engine after the war. I don't know exactly when it was, but when we were there, one of the planes crashed out in the desert. Of course, both the cadets were killed, and for no reason, and we kind of nobody told us, but they've been having a real problem. There was something like 18 cadets had been lost over a period of time, and with no real answers. They'd find them crashed, and they couldn't figure it out. But this time they kind of got lucky because they found part of the wing about a mile away from the crash, and so they started digging into that, and the leading edge of the wings was formed with a thin plywood, and it was formed around the front edge of the wing, a curve clear around it, and I suppose soaked and formed, but anyway, then it was glued on to the wooden spars in the wing. Then of course the wing was covered with canvas, which went right over the plywood and formed the wing. But down there in the desert it was beastly hot, and the humidity, we took weather and it got down to almost 2% at one time. And what happened, the glue dried out on these wings, and that piece of plywood was actually loose inside the wing there. And when they were flying, if something put stress on it or something and split that canvas a little bit, then the wind got behind that leading edge and it flew off, and of course they were on their way down. It was almost instantaneous, they assumed, and that's why they didn't have any time to call in or anything. But they inspected all the planes then, and a very high percentage of them, that leading edge was absolutely loose, wasn't even fastened to the wing, but the canvas was holding it on. But needless to say, they did a little quick gluing and canvassing, and we were back in business. Another little problem was that plane, when you landed, you couldn't put the brakes on and bring it to a steady halt. You had to pump them just on and off and on and off all the way in, or it would get hot and you'd blow a tire every time. So they really got after you that way. In fact, I still drive my cars that way. If it's good for an airplane, why, yeah, I think it's good for car brakes also. We started night flying down there. I don't know what kind of runway lights they had, but they seemed like they was kind of from the sides, and they were only about, actually up in the air about 10 feet high. I mean the beam themselves. And boy, it was tricky. You'd come in and it was an optical illusion or something. You'd try to land on the top of that light, and boy, when that thing paid off, you dropped her about 10 feet, and I'm telling you, you thought you was going through the runway. But it happened twice to me, but you finally learned how to do it. But they all had problems with it, and they warned you of it, but you still did it. Of course, it was hot down there, and you had little side windows, and you always had those open, and you even took off with them open. I don't know if it was a thing to do, but we did. And another cadet and I can't remember who it was now, but we started on a cross country. I think it was a triangular cross country. And I think we'd landed that the first one was taking off on the second one and starting to climb, and we would shut the windows after we got up and it got cooled off, but we were starting to climb, and I had the map and kind of held it out in front of me and across the steering column there, and all of a sudden it was just a great big whoosh of wind, and it went through that plane and took that map out the window, and we were on our own trying to go on this cross country, so we decided, well, there were several others on this cross country, so we poured on the cobs, and we got caught up with one place we could keep him in sight within 5 miles or so. We followed him around and got home all right. We didn't tell anybody, but I don't know what we'd done. We'd had to turn around and try to go home, I guess, if we hadn't caught up to that other guy. While we're there, one of the instructors I flew with quite a bit, and real nice guy. There were 3 instructors, and they each took a plane, and they flew to Salt Lake City for the weekend. I don't know, one of them had family or girlfriends or something there. But I guess on the way home, they were kind of just flying not right close together, but within sight of each other. They could see this one guy, this guy I liked so well, kind of started off a gentle downward path, and they headed and called on him on the radio, and he wouldn't answer and wouldn't answer, and they tried to catch up with him. They were going to try and put their wingtips under his and bump him and see if he was asleep or something, but before they could catch up with him, he flew right into the side of the mountain and was killed. As I've told you before, it seemed like every place had some stunt going on that you had to do it to be one of the boys. Well, I never did it, but I watched it done a couple times. Of course, it was very desolate land out in the desert down there, and you had to see these trains that would go you could see them going for miles across that desert. And it was all perfectly level, nothing around but cactus. And guys had watched till they could find a troop train down there, and they'd go down and get flying with the train right over it, and these things you could put the flaps down and they would fly awfully slow, and they'd fly right down over that train and just keep edging down and edging down and edging down until they touch their wheels on the top of that troop train. Here are all the guys, you can see them down there hanging out of that troop train looking up at that plane about 3 feet above their head, but they did it. Now, I mean, it's something to see, but the guys they'd find something to do at every place that weren't supposed to do. Of course, Douglas was right down on the border, and we had an auxiliary field that was up, as I remember, up north someplace there. Wasn't too far, but we went up, flew there, and we went over Warren and Bisbee. They're 2 small towns, and they were built right on the side, each side of the canyon. The cities went right up on the sides of it, and there were some huge copper mines there. I don't know, maybe the biggest ones in the United States, but anyway, this auxiliary field was directly beyond them a ways, and we'd go there, and I remember we'd shoot night landings and stuff over at that other field, and we'd come home maybe at 1 o'clock in the morning or something, but we'd fly right down this canyon at house-top levels. I mean, you could look and see the houses and stuff right on either side of you. Then we'd pull our prop pitch to high pitch or low pitch, and they'd just wind up and make the worst racket you can possibly imagine. But I bet those people got sick of that because it went on forever, because every cadet came right down that canyon. I don't know why they didn't stop us, but that's what was going on. And kids thought we thought we were having a ball. I guess we were. Agua Prieta was a little Mexican town just south on the other side of the river there. We went over a few times, but there are a few things that you could go do, but nothing that really amounted to anything. It was really a dirty little town, but we did go over and buy jewelry and silk stockings to send home. Of course, they couldn't get them in the United States, and that was kind of the big deal. But that's really all there was there. Well, then the big day came, August the 4th, and we got our wings and our commissions. We were sworn in as second lieutenants, and that was quite a good feeling to feel like you'd really made it through all that and survived all the kids that got washed out and everything. And so you're immediately were officers and gentlemen, supposedly, but still only 19 years old. And we was sent on our ways. At that time, when you were an enlisted man, they always sent somebody with you and carried all your orders and so forth. You didn't have your orders, but when you were an officer, then you immediately had to start carrying your orders from one base to the other. And so I should have some orders from each place now if I can get them all dug out. I'm going to see if I can find them from shipping from Douglas. From when we got graduated, then we got to go home for a leave. That was the first time we'd been home since we got into basic training.
And this is my diploma from Advanced Flight Training, United States Army Air Forces, Advanced Pilot School. Be it known that Boyd D. Clements, Second Lieutenant of the United States Army Air Forces, has satisfactorily completed the course of instruction prescribed for advanced pilot training. In testimony thereof, and by virtue of vested authority, I do confer upon him this diploma, given at Douglas Air Force Base, Douglas, Arizona, on this, the 4th day of August, in the year of our Lord 1944. Commanding Officer Harvey Dyer, Colonel. This is my first set of travel orders as an officer. Headquarters, 3014th Air Force Base Unit Pilot School Advanced, Douglas, Arizona. Extract. The following names, Second Lieutenant, unless otherwise indicated, now at this station are transferred to Kingman Air Force Base, Kingman, Arizona, for B-17 co-pilot training the 4th of August 44, to arrive thereafter not later than the 16th of August 44. 10 travel plus 10 days delay en route, reporting upon arrival to the CO for duty. That order was cut for just one person that way, because each one had different destinations and travel time and so forth. Okay, when I graduated from Kingman, when I graduated Douglas, I got a few days off, so I went home, spent a few days there, and then I headed for Kingman. Okay, Lincoln, back out to Kingman. As you can kind of start to see on this map, I was assigned to the Western Flying Training Command, and the headquarters were at Santa Ana, California. So all my training was in that area. There was another headquarters down at San Antonio, Texas, and I think that was a southern, but I think there was one in the east, but I only knew of those two that I was familiar with. I really enjoyed the few days at home, because that's the first we'd been home since we left home for basic training, and that was quite a long stretch of time for a kid the first time he's been away in his life. And a lot of kids got kind of homesick, but they did keep us so darn busy that you got over it. One other thing, when you got a commission, they didn't hand out clothes to you anymore, so you had to take your little bit of pay raise you got. I think we went to $150 a month from, you know, basic or privates were $50, and we got cadets was $75, and then we went up to $150 as officers. Anyway, we had to buy our own clothes. They had places on base where you could buy them and get fitted, so that was another nick out of your money. And of course, we all traveled individually when, as an officer, and got into Kingman and had to report into the base headquarters, commanding officer, and you were assigned barracks and so forth. And first day there, one of the kids come in and he says, everybody's supposed to read the bulletin boards, and I read it, and I was assigned for flying the first night, if I remember right. I'm not positive, either the first night or the second night I was there, my name come up for a night flight. I couldn't believe it, but I'd never been close to a B-17 in my life. I had seen one once in the air before then, but that was it. And so that night I headed down to the flight line, and they told me, pointed out an airplane out there. So I went out there, and no pilot was there yet, so I kind of hung around there, afraid to even get close to the thing, but they were loading a bunch of gunners in. Kingman was a big gunnery school, and well, it was a large gunnery school. And also they trained some bombardier cadets there at the same time, were getting training. And so I hung around there, and they loaded a bunch of gunners in, and here come this pilot. And he was really bent out of shape. I'm assuming because he was stuck at Kingman flying gunnery schools and flying fresh pilots just got their wings. So we crawled up in that big plane, and I sat down in that co-pilot seat, and I was just absolutely in awe. It had dials and gauges and lights all over that thing, and all the gauges had kind of a green coating on them, and then they had little blue lights that would make those gauges glow. And I just thought I'd gotten in over my head, but he crawled in there, and he threw me this checklist and says, read me the checklist, and I read it, and he pulled gadgets and buttons and everything, and he told me to start one, and I said, well, how does, and he showed me this switch, and he says, hold that switch until it starts. So I did it, and man, the old thing belched and vibrated, and we got all four of them started, and he took off and climbed up to altitude, didn't say boo, and leveled off. I don't know how high, we were a couple thousand feet high, I'm guessing, I don't remember anymore. But he unfastened his seat belt and started to get up, and he says, call me in an hour and a half, I'm going down and take a nap. And I started to plead with the guy. And he just says, you got your goddamn wings, haven't you? And I says, yes. And he says, call me in an hour and a half. Well, I'll tell you, that was a long hour and a half. And I never touched the throttles except to maintain altitude, and I made a great big circle around that air base where I could see it out of my co-pilot side of the seat. And I don't think I even banked it in turns. I made the turns were gentle enough that I could skid it around the turns, and that's all I did, and held my breath for an hour and a half. And I told some guy to go down and get him. He come up, and he still didn't say boo to me. Down and landed it, and away he went. And that was really an introduction. I looked out to the wings. It was dark, you could hardly see them, and the little lights, the red and the green light on the ends of the wings, and it just looked like a monster. I thought was clear out of place, but it worked out. But I got to looking, I didn't realize it till the other night. I was going through my flying records, and he didn't even give me my flying hours for that flight. took, it was hot out there too, and you'd get in that plane, and it was so beastly hot. Those guys would get in there for gunnery training, and oh, they would get sick. Take them on this flight, and when they got sick, they had to go up in the bomb bay. There's a catwalk through the bomb bay with the kind of ropes where you could walk through there. That's where they got sick. They'd send them up there, and they could puke down in the bottom of the bomb bay. And when they got back, why, we'd open the bomb bay doors, and they had to all go back. The whole gang had to go get buckets and brooms and wash out those bomb bay doors when we got back. We pulled them. We had air to air gunnery and air to ground gunnery, where the airplane would pull a sock, and then we'd fly by, and they would all shoot at that sock. And of course, every 10th bullet or something like that was a tracer, so they could pretty much see how close they were coming, and it was good practice. They got pretty good at it. And then we'd fly real low to the ground, out over the desert, over the cactus, and they had objects set up out in the desert where we'd go by, and they'd shoot at these still objects set down in the desert. We always said we were glad we were doing what we were doing and not flying one of those tow planes for the target, because some of those guys were very good shot. One day at the base there, another guy and I were walking along on the base there, and here come this big squadron of cadets. They were bombardier cadets, and of course they took bombardier training there too, and with the Northern Bomb Sight, and went to school for quite a while. I don't know how long they were there, but here come this big squadron, boy, marching so neat and nice. And who should be in charge of this squadron but my old friend Sergeant Provenzano from Utah. I recognized him. Of course, he was a sergeant and I was an officer then. I stopped that whole squadron and asked him if he remembered me. Well, I think he did, but probably not. But I kind of let him know who I was. And during this episode, while I was having fun, I looked back in the squadron and I spotted this kid kind of grinning back there. Lo and behold, it was Arlen Krause from my hometown, and he was just a year ahead of me in high school. And I couldn't believe it, so I still kept him. The squadron stopped and went back and talked to him and found out where he was staying, what barracks he was at, and then went over later that night and visited with him. But that doesn't happen very often, I'll tell you. That something that was one in a million. We didn't get a lot of flying hours, but mainly we took an awful lot of classroom study on the B-17, because there are all kinds of things to, maybe I can look and see all the things that we studied, but it was a lot of classroom work. I think it was about 2 days before we left, a kid that was in my barracks there from Lincoln, Nebraska, Davis was his last name, was real friendly with him. They had to take a night flight, and I do not know what happened, but they flew into the side of the mountain, Frisco Peak. It's real, you can see it from miles around Kingman, and was killed. I went down to the base headquarters the next day and told him that I says he was from Lincoln and I knew him, and if there's anything I could do, that I was headed to Lincoln anyway. I wanted to go back with the body or anything, but they says no, go right ahead, because you don't know how long it'll be to get to the crash site and get it cleaned up. I was always going to go look up parents or something and the family, and I just never had it in me to do it when I got home. I suppose I should have. I forgot to list my flying hours at Advanced Flight School. If I can read this right, student co-pilot time, 46 hours and 50 minutes. Student dual time, 24 hours and 25 minutes. Night flying, 1 hour and 30 minutes. Student first pilot time, 32 hours and 25 minutes.